This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Welcome to the Journey Step-by-Step Christian Podcast with me, your host, Karyn Beach. Now, this is the first official episode, and it's truly the result of following the Lord's directives. Each episode will be uploaded every 2 weeks, with 6 episodes per season. So we're starting it off with the spring. We're starting our growth. Get it? We're starting in the spring. Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? And when we get done with 6 spring episodes, guess what time it'll be? It'll be time for summer. Do you see how that works? Spring, summer, fall, winter. And then we'll start again with a new year, a new season. It's just such a good way to do it. Thank you, Lord, for giving me that idea. 2 episodes of each season, like tonight's episodes, will be testimonies. 2 episodes will be like our next episode, which is a Bible study. And we'll look at verses. We'll look at concepts. Next time we'll be looking at prayer. And we'll be looking for a deeper meaning in how we can use these verses, these concepts to grow our faith. 2 episodes will be a roundtable discussion with other Christians where we'll talk about issues and concerns that Christians face. The first roundtable is going to talk about work. You know, if you're a 24/7 Christian, which you should be, it means that your faith comes with you to work. What does that look like? How do you use it? What do you do? We're going to talk about that in our first roundtable episode. But let's get back to tonight. Tonight we're talking to Sherri Simmons. She's a former church first lady. A church first lady. Not Melania Trump, not Michelle Obama, but she's a church first lady, and we'll talk about what that means. We'll also talk about her incredible journey. She's had some amazing experiences that she chronicles in her book, Underneath the Hat. She's going to talk about who became her God, how she found the real God, as well as keeping up appearances and living a lie. There's a lot to her testimony, and I'm sure you'll find something in it that you can relate to. So with no further ado, here's Sherri Simmons and I talking testimony. We're going to do our first testimonial today with Sherri Simmons. Sherri is a former First Lady. Now, a lot of you know what that means, but for some of you, that might be new terminology. A First Lady is how some people refer to the pastor's wife. So some people call it the pastor's wife. Some people call it the First Lady. And I know in my circle of friends, I have several friends that would do anything to be a First Lady of a church. And then there are people like me who run the other way because, you know, if I cuss too much. I cuss too much to be a First Lady. I'd be in a situation and say, "What the beep?" And they'd be like, "World, right. The pastor's wife said this to me." The First Lady was dropping F-bombs because occasionally, and then someone would be driving with me and they'd be getting out of the car repenting because I know I need help with my language, especially when I'm driving. But having said all that, Karyn, welcome to the journey.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I can't wait to hear more about your journey. Now, since you were the First Lady of a church, I'm assuming that you grew up in the church.
Yes. I've been inside the church since I was 10 years old, active in every capacity possible, from being a praise dancer, being over the youth usher board, being in the choir, being on different ministries as their secretary. So I worked my way up the ranks, and now my mom is a minister, so now I'm a PK. So I've worked my way up the ranks in every capacity possible over the years.
When you say PK, you said a mouthful right there. But
Yeah.
how did you always want to be a pastor's wife? Were you one of those women that wanted to be the first lady?
Absolutely not. I grew up under United Church of Christ. And so we had first ladies, but we did not identify them as such. They didn't have such this grandiose persona as they do in most denominations like Baptist, which is the denomination I was under as first lady. So we had the pastor's or the minister's wife, but she wasn't held to such a high standard as I saw and was in my role as first lady.
Yeah, because it seems to me like churches that use the first lady moniker, you really are almost like the first lady. You carry so much, you actually have a position that carries a lot of authority.
Absolutely.
So for people that aren't familiar with first ladies, what did that mean? What were your responsibilities as a first lady?
So as a first lady, I was basically the helpmate to the pastor. So at my former church, I was a deaconess, so I helped with communion. I also was in the choir, so I would direct songs, I would lead songs, and I would really help my husband at the time to make sure that the vision he had for the church was carried out. So another thing that I did, I worked with the youth because I'm a teacher with Chicago Public Schools. So I had that background. So I tried to find my niche inside of the church, which is similar to what the First Lady does of the President of the United States. Try to find that area where you're comfortable and where you can be hands-on and help to improve and increase the church.
Okay. And how did you become first lady? How did you meet your husband? Your now ex-husband.
Ex-husband, yes. I met him in high school. We both went to Whitney Young. He was 2 years ahead of me, and I met him my freshman year. He was a junior, and we had a history class together. And he used to bother me and annoy me because I was already in a relationship, so I really wasn't interested in him. But he would always bother me. And finally, I gave in my sophomore, junior year. And by then, he had graduated and gone on to college. So we met at high school.
Okay. And when did he know he was going to be a pastor?
He was actually preaching when we met. He did his first sermon when he was 16, 17 years old, and he became licensed 2 years later. So by the time we became really serious, he had already done his trial sermon and have been licensed under the Baptist denomination to be a preacher. So I went into a relationship with a man of God, and I knew that going in. I just didn't know how difficult it would be and how I had to learn what my role was and where I stood in place in his life, because I knew that I wouldn't be first. So trying to maneuver that at such a young age was very difficult at times.
Right, because the church came before you, correct?
Yeah. And then he also had family that were sickly. He had a sick grandmother and grandfather and mother. So he was tending to them as well. And so I ended up being third on the totem pole. And so having to come to grips with that and still be okay with my purpose and my place, I had a hard time dealing with that and understanding everything that was going on. But I was willing to deal with it because I loved him. But it was definitely challenging at times.
Okay. And where was your faith at this time? I mean, did you rely on that when he was having these other things that took priority over you?
I can honestly say that I knew who God was, but I didn't have a close relationship with him. And so the church where I grew up, yes, we heard a sermon every week, but I really wasn't being spiritually fed there. I really didn't start to understand my relationship with God until I would go with my ex-husband to his different preaching engagements, and I would go visit his church and be exposed to the Baptist denomination, that I got a clear understanding of who God was and the relationship that I should have with him. And even in the midst of me learning through going to different places with him, I really didn't have a full understanding of my relationship with God until after all these things transpired with me and my ex-husband, which led to our divorce.
So what were some of the things that transpired?
So we got married when I was 23 and he was 25, and he was my first love, and I was just infatuated with everything. I say in my book underneath the hat that he was my God, because I would always ask, well, what would he think? What would he say? So that was the driving force behind a lot of the decisions that I made. Mm-hmm. And so when I got married at 23, I graduated with my bachelor's degree in early elementary education in May, and we got married in July. So I went from a dorm room to keeping a husband in a house. And it was like so much going on at one time. And I really wasn't taught how to be a wife, because my mother had divorced my father and had remarried, but their relationship was rocky. So I was taught how to be a teacher. So that's where I put all my time and energy, and making sure my classroom was okay and doing everything that I needed to excel in my career. So there were times where I didn't do everything that I could have done of being a wife because of the fact that I was not taught how to be one. Okay. So when I married at 23, he was still a minister. He hadn't been years into our marriage. So I was really just going with him to all of his preaching engagements. I was at one church, he was at the other until our third year, and then we both joined the same church. And while there, he was the youth pastor, and I was on the usher board. So I was still being a minister's wife and doing those different things that I could within that position that he had, but it became more extensive once he became pastor.
Okay. And did you all have kids?
No, thank God. So we did not have any children, even though we really wanted to. And during our marriage, I found out that I suffered from fibroids.
Okay.
So that was the reason that I thought it was really God speaking, like, no, we don't need to bring any children into this mess, before I even knew that there was a mess. I was just happy that we had figured out what the issue was, because we had tried for like 2 years and I wasn't able to get pregnant. And so I went through infertility and found out what the problem was, but he refused to do his part in going through conceiving a child through IVF or IUI once we found out what the issue was.
Okay.
So that was the first thing. So we had 7 godchildren, but no children of our own.
Okay. You had no children of your own. And when did the cracks begin to show in your marriage?
The cracks began to show in March 2012. He was the person who basically was in charge of all the finances. We both together we made 6 figures. And so with me coming from a dorm to a house, I wasn't sure of how to budget and do all these things because I wasn't exposed to it. Whereas he was, because he took care of the household of his grandparents and his mom. So he took over the responsibility of the finances. So I never asked any questions. As long as the lights were on and I could go shopping when I wanted to and we went on vacation, I didn't ask any questions. But God woke me up in the middle of the night. It was 4:26 a.m. And he sent me to the table where we kept all the bills. And I went to the bank statement and I noticed that there was a purchase for Ladies Foot Locker and there was a purchase for Legoland. And I'm like, he hasn't bought me anything from Ladies Foot Locker and we didn't go to Legoland. So I asked him the next morning, and he came up with this story of saying that I bought you something from Ladies Foot Locker, but we got into an argument, so I took it back. So my thing was, well, it should show up on the account. Where is it? He's like, oh, they gave me a gift card. Well, where's the gift card? It was $200 worth of gym shoes.
Okay.
He couldn't tell me what the gift card was. Okay, I said, well, what about Legoland? He said by this time he was pastor of a church. He said, I went there to research to see if this would be a good place to take the kids, the youth of the church. So I called and asked them, based on the amount that was on the bank statement, how many people would this be for? Because it was like $80-something. And I know you're not having that much fun in Legoland by yourself. So they told me it was for about 2 or 3 people. And so the wheels started turning. Now, at this moment, we had a joint bank account. And he had his own separate account. Again, naive, didn't know. I know now, though. So we had a joint account, and all of a sudden, he pulled his money out of the account, which was another red flag. I'm wondering, if nothing's going on, why are you now removing your money? And so from then on, we started. By this time, we were already sleeping in separate rooms. And I figured it's because he was depressed because he had lost his grandmother, his grandfather, and his mother all within 2 years of each other. Okay. So I figured he was going through this deep depression and that he just needed to be by himself. But I was still supporting, still taking things off his plate so that he could focus on his sermons every week, just trying to be that wife that I felt he needed me to be, given all that he had gone through. And then one day he came in, it was July 6th, 3 days after my birthday. And he came in and he said, I think we need to separate. So my whole world was like, okay. So I'm thinking the whole time that it was me. Because the one thing he said was that I wasn't domestic. I didn't cook. I didn't clean the way he wanted me to, which I didn't understand because neither one of us ever went hungry. You had people coming to the house all the time. So if the house wasn't up to your standards, why are people being invited to the house?
Right.
So, but God knew what he was doing because the five days before he asked me to move out, I had gotten a promotion from a teacher to an assistant principal. Okay. So I went from making 5 figures to 6 figures. And the money that I had saved, that the school system had saved for us during the summer, dropped into my account, which was like $7,600. So I was able to use that money to move out. So he told me July 6th he wanted to separate. July 27th, I had moved into my own condo.
Okay.
And so from there, I was in the mindset that it was me. It was because I wasn't domestic. I wasn't cooking. I wasn't cleaning. So that's what I worked on. All while I was in this condo, hoping that we would make our way back to each other and I would be a better wife for him that he needed, not knowing that it had nothing to do with the cooking and cleaning at all.
What did it have to do with?
I eventually found out. I had went out of town in December, so I moved out in July. I went out of town to Vegas for Christmas in December, and I found out from one of my godchildren after finally telling people that I had moved out, because my parents didn't know I had moved out. The only person that knew was my aunt and my best friend. My family had no idea. My parents and my siblings didn't find out I had moved out until right before I went on vacation. So for 5 months, I had been lying to people.
Okay.
And I was still going to church. I moved out July 27th, which was a Saturday afternoon. Sunday morning, I was at church with my hat on, acting as if nothing had happened.
Wow.
So the church didn't even know I had moved out. The church didn't know we were living in separate houses. I even had a story lined up so that if someone saw me on the opposite side of town, then I would say I was picking my sister up because she worked at a restaurant not far from where I lived.
Mm-hmm.
So I was doing all these things to save his image and his reputation as pastor, not knowing that he wasn't protecting me at all. Because it came out from my goddaughter that he was having an affair.
Okay.
She didn't believe it because of the fact that, like everybody who found out, were shocked to find out because we were like Velcro. We were stuck like glue. We were always together. So for her to hear these rumors for a year, she didn't believe it because she always saw us together. And when I finally told her that we were separated, that's when she started showing me all these pictures and Facebook messages and text messages, because the one that he was messing around with was the cousin of her best friend. And
Wow.
we all went to church together. We all went to the church that I had joined prior to him becoming pastor.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how did you reconcile all these stories you were telling and everything with your faith? Or did you?
It was hard because it was hard, yet it wasn't. Me going through this made me become closer to God because I gave so much power to my ex-husband. As I stated before, he was my God, and we know that God is jealous. And so God literally had to pick me up out of that situation and drop me somewhere else. And I'll never forget, I was in my living room. I actually moved right across the street from Lake Michigan. And it was a Wednesday night. And I was sitting in front of my window, and God said, I did all this. I was the only one in the house, but I heard him say just as clear as day, I did all this.
Wow.
So in that moment, I realized that I had been giving credit to a person who God was using as a vessel. But ultimately, he was the reason that I was have been given all the opportunities and accolades and successes that I had received. It wasn't my ex-husband. He was using him to deliver him, but it was ultimately him because he showed me that night that he's nowhere around. But you're blessed even more than you were when you were in the house with him.
Right.
So from then on, my relationship with God became the best relationship I've ever had, even to this day. Like, I had to reflect and realize that, yes, there were some things I could have done differently, but it didn't justify the decisions that he made to do the things that he did.
Right.
But I had to reflect in order to change myself so that I could be a better Sherri for me versus trying to be a better Sherri for my ex-husband.
Now, a lot of people... Oh, go on.
Mm-hmm.
Go on.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say a lot of people in the church have, looked down on divorce, and you shouldn't get divorced and you should do everything you can do. But what if the other person isn't doing anything?
Right. And that was a thing because when we got divorced, we got divorced in September of 2004. No, October of 2000. Wait, no, September. We got divorced September 2014. He didn't tell the church until October. So I left the church a couple of months before we got divorced. So for a year and a half, I was coming to church. More and more stuff was coming out. I found out that he had a relationship with the goddaughter that told me what was going on, Kind of find out he had a relationship with her mother. He had relationships with other women in the church. So there were about 5 or 6 women.
Wow.
That had either been around me, or I had served at church, or we were members of the church, or they were like a sister to me. My goddaughter's mom, we've been on vacation together. We've been to their house. They've been to ours. I'm helping pay my goddaughter's tuition because her mother's not paying it. Like he had all these relationships with these people that were right under my nose. And we all went to the same church. And people in the church knew what was going on and said nothing to me.
Wow.
Because they have this whole thing of, well, it's not my business. And I ultimately didn't find out that a lot of people knew until after we had divorced. So when we divorced in September, October, I came to him because I had an inconclusive pap smear. And he was the only one that I was intimate with. And so I ended up contracting HPV, which is a sexually transmitted disease, which could lead to, I was at level 1 of cervical cancer. So I went to him and he denied everything. And so that was the Sunday. I went to him that Sunday morning, like 5 o'clock in the morning. And I went to him that Sunday morning. And later that morning, he announced to the church that we had been divorced. Mind you, we had been divorced for a month.
Right.
He hadn't told anyone. So they're thinking I'm still their first lady. And he decides to announce it only because I came to him with information that he made me sick.
Mm.
So I guess to get to them before I did, he went ahead and told them that we had been divorced. Right. But before then, they knew nothing about what was going on.
So
because they saw me come every day.
What did you leave? I'm sure you left that church then.
Yes, I had left that church. I actually had joined another church in October, so I had already left a couple of months before the papers were signed. And so I had joined the church in October, like a couple of weeks before I went to confront him about my test results. So I was already a member of another church. And when I came to confront him, he actually wouldn't even let me inside the church. He had his security stop me at the door, and he and 2 of his deacons came out to have a conversation with me to prevent me from coming inside the church.
Wow. So that was in 2014.
So he had his green.
So yeah, what?
Right.
How have things changed for you since 2014 when you got the divorce?
So much has changed. I was a very quiet person, and I still am an introvert, just not as much. I was a very quiet person, and I think that's why it was so easy for him to get over on me about a lot of things, because I was so quiet and I kept to myself. But now, writing this book, God allowed for the book to not only serve as therapy for me, but it also allowed for me to be able to share my story and help other women who are suffering in silence. Because when I was going through this, I felt like I was the only one who it had ever happened to. And it wasn't until I started sharing my story with people around me that I came to realize that they've been going through the same thing or had gone through the same things that I had gone through, and they were still standing. So the book that I wrote ultimately has turned into forms and opportunities for me to be able to share my story with women and young ladies so that we can change the way that we see ourselves, which will ultimately allow for us to be better women and make better decisions in the relationships that we make. So I've since gotten remarried. So we're celebrating 3 years in July. And I have my book that's out. And from the book, I've branched off into a YouTube series where I interview different people about topics that I dealt with inside of my marriage that I discuss in the book, from infidelity to divorce to mother-daughter relationships, because ultimately the things that I accepted from him was because of the things that I saw my mother accept from her ex-husband. And we dealt with father-daughter relationships because I ultimately ended up marrying my father. Based on the relationship that I had with him, there were similarities between he and my first husband.
Wow.
And so every month I film 2 episodes and I upload them onto my YouTube channel, where other people that I've reached out to get to share their story so that we can reach the masses who may be feeling like they're going through the same thing, but in silence. And coming up March 2nd, every Saturday from March to June of this year, I'll be hosting a radio show called Underneath the Hat, where we'll take those same topics and have a deeper discussion about them over the radio waves. And people get to call in and share their testimonies and experiences so we can ultimately help more people. I also do monthly panel discussions around the same topic. So I'm trying to touch people in every way possible, whether it's over the radio, through the internet, or in person, so that we can get our stories told and help those people who feel like they're in it by themselves. And then finally, I have a foundation called Young Ladies at All Times, because throughout all of the things that I found out about, all of the hurt and pain and embarrassment and ridicule that I had to deal with, of learning about people who I worship with every Sunday, having relationships with my husband, yet smiling in my face, I still carry myself as a young lady, because I'm able to have this conversation with you, not behind prison walls.
True. A lot of women can't say that. But
yes.
how have you been able to forgive those women or your ex-husband for that problem? For that,
I can say within the last couple of months, I've been able to forgive him. I think the more I talk about it and the more that I reflect on different things, the more I'm able to forgive him and realize that he has the problem, is not me, and that I can't continue to blame him for the things that I felt and continue to hold on to that, because all it's doing is blocking my blessing. So once I was able to finally forgive him and the women that did it to me, I've even had a conversation. I've had a conversation with 2 of the women, no, 3 of them. And I told them, I'm not mad at you, because you didn't stand with me in front of hundreds of guests and in front of God and pledge your love and devotion and loyalty to me. I just need to know what happened, because I wasn't getting any information from him. So I had to, the last 2 people I had to forgive, and it just happened within the last couple of months, were my ex-husband and my godchildren's mother. Right. Because she was the closest to me and she called herself my sister. And so for it to have happened the way that it did, and it's actually still happening. And so I'm like, that was the hardest one to forgive, was her and my ex-husband. But since I have forgiven them, so many doors have opened, and it's so crazy because God has a funny sense of humor. He will return you back to the scene of the crime. So about 3 weeks ago, I was just invited to speak for Women's Day at the church where we all went to church together.
Wow.
So in May, I'll be their keynote speaker for Women's Day. And this will be the first time that I have stepped inside of this church since all of this came out. So in like 6 years.
Wow. Is he still there?
No, he's this church where I'm speaking is the church that we joined together before he became pastor. So okay. He's still pastor at his church. So he's still there as pastor. But this church where I'm speaking for Women's Day is the church where all of the infidelity and things happened right up under my nose, where I was the usher and he was the youth pastor, and he was having all of these extramarital relationships with women that were members of the church.
Wow. So what advice would you have for women looking to get married?
Ooh. Because I was so young when I did it, I would definitely say spend time with yourself first. Get to know who you are first. I knew because we had met when I was so young, I was 16. And so I stayed with him for 7 years before we even got married. So I thought I knew who I was, but I really didn't. I was at that age where I was being molded, and I was being molded by him to be able to accept foolishness, because he already had this idea of how he wanted things to be. So he was molding me into the wife that would be able to accept it and would have nowhere else to go. But God had other plans for me. And so he allowed for me to be surrounded by people, whether in my field of education or at the church where I grew up, where I was able to see something different. So I wasn't completely blindsided or having tunnel vision, where I only focused on his people that became comfortable with living in foolishness. So definitely my biggest bit of advice would be to get to know who you are first before you try to tie yourself spiritually, emotionally, and mentally with someone else, because you can ultimately be intertwined with them so much till you lose who you are.
And you lose who God is. Because like
Yes.
you said, you were so focused on him, he became, in a way, your God.
Exactly.
Now, what advice would you have for women that are in a marriage, maybe a marriage that's riddled with infidelity?
I would say to pray and ask God for guidance and what you should do next. Because even though a lot of people frown upon marriage in the church, even though it's happening with 50% of our marriages now, even though they frown upon it, it is in the Bible that infidelity is the one reason why you should get a divorce. God says it himself. And so before you make that leap, make sure that you and God are on the same page, because he made me move. I know for a fact that if it were not for God picking me up and moving me the way that he did, that I would probably still be in that relationship. Because even when God was showing me things, reasons to leave, I wasn't paying attention because I was so manipulated and controlled by my ex-husband.
Right.
But because my relationship with God got stronger, I was able to recognize his voice and know when it was him talking to me and not somebody else. So definitely having a stronger relationship with God and opening your heart and your mind to hear what he has to tell you and show you, even if it's something that you don't want to see or hear. I always knew it was God because it was something I didn't want to do. I knew I should do it, but I didn't want to do it. Whereas with the devil, he entices you with things that he knows you like.
True.
So that's why I was able to make a lot of the moves that I was able to make, because I knew that it was God who was causing things to happen.
All right. Final question. And I probably should have asked you about this before, but is there a verse or is there something that you kind of held on to when you were going through these rough times?
I will say that I was always in my Bible, and my favorite verse comes from Psalms 118, verse 6. It says, "The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do unto me?" because I was so worried about what other people thought. And that was the driving force for me making some of the moves that I made and not moving as fast as I should have, even though God was showing me what to do. And once I finally stopped worrying about what other people thought and what they could do to me and what they could say about me, and realized that he was holding me and carrying me the whole time, things started to shift. And so I know that I would not be here at this moment in my life having this conversation with you if I focused so much on what other people thought and said.
Okay,
So,
and what the name of your book? What's the name of your book?
Underneath the Hat.
Underneath the Hat of the First Lady.
Yes.
And a lot was going on underneath that hat, just from what we talked about here. A whole lot was going on underneath that hat. But Sherri, thank you so much for talking to me, for being my inaugural guest. I appreciate it. And I mean, it's so interesting to talk about how you were in that marriage, how, you know, your husband became your God, but how God led you out of it. He led you out of it and into a much better situation. And I'm grateful and happy for you for that. So thank you so much, Sherri.
Thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Okay. Now, how often do we create gods and put them before the Lord? Now, we aren't living in biblical times, so we aren't talking about melting down our gold earrings and creating golden calves or things like that. But for Sherri, the God she put before the Lord was her husband. It could be work, it could be money, it could even be our kids. But when these things take precedence over the time, the attention, and the guidance that should only come from and go to the Lord, we run into problems. Now, for me, it was work. Without a spouse or a significant other, I had to rely on myself to create the life I wanted. I identified myself through my work. I was a trainer. I was an instructional designer. I am a coach. It was a very, very, very big part of who I was. And my decisions were often based around work. Funny thing about work, though, you work with other people. And on more than one occasion, I was affected by the pettiness, the insecurities, and the office politics that inevitably came with work. Now, I have a friend who will say the answer to all this is owning your own business. But my response to her would be the same. Your clients and your customers are people too. So putting your faith in them, or even fully in your own ability to be the next Jeff Bezos, would not be a good idea. People are people. People aren't the Lord. Now, I'm still learning and growing in my faith, and I will be for the rest of my life. Right now, I'm dealing with job loss, yet again. But this time, it's a little bit different. This time, I'm asking Him what His will is for me. I realize now that it isn't about what I want, but what He wants for me. I can go after what I want as much as I want, but if it's not God's desire for me, guess what? It's not going to work out. So instead of putting all my efforts into things that may or may not work out, instead of following my will, I've learned to follow His. It isn't about pleasing my boss. It's about pleasing my Lord. So, Sherri gave us a lot to think about. And I challenge you for the next couple weeks to think about that. Who is your God? Who is your Lord? Who are you serving in your day-to-day life? Is it the real God? Is it really the Lord? Or is it one of these other things that often end up taking the place of the Lord in our lives? If you have any comments or suggestions, you can find The Journey on Instagram at journey.podcast. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/journeypodcast. You can email me at journeypodcast77@gmail. You see the trend here? Journey Podcast, Journey Podcast, Journey Podcast. And of course, a lot of this information about Sherri's book, about where you can find us, is in the show description. So with that, I'm going to end the show by encouraging you to be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And I'm going to go for another 2 weeks, and then I will see you with another episode of the Journey Podcast. God bless.